The 23rd of April, 1917, dawned cold and merciless across the Flanders mud, where Private William Ernest Brooks crouched in a trench that smelled of death, cordite, and the acrid stench of mustard gas that had drifted through 2 nights prior. The former sheep farmer from Yorkshire had spent 37 years tending flocks on windswept moors before king and country called him to this hell, and now he found himself staring at a problem that reminded him oddly of the foxes that once plagued his lambing season, except these predators carried Guhar 98s and could kill from 600 yards away. German snipers had turned the British trenches into killing galleries. Every dawn brought fresh corpses, men who raised their heads a fraction too high, soldiers who forgot that daylight belonged to the enemy marksmen perched in reinforced positions across no man's land. The statistics were grimly efficient. 7 men in Brooks's battalion had died in the past 4 days alone, each from a single bullet to the head or neck. The sniper threat had become so severe that officers issued orders forbidding any unnecessary movement during daylight hours, transforming the trenches into claustrophobic prisons where men could barely stretch without risking sudden death. Brooks watched Corporal James Mitchinsuna, locomotive engineer from Leeds, lean against the trench wall, exhausted after a sleepless night of listening to artillery thunder in the distance. Mitchinson tilted his head back for just a moment, seeking relief from the crick in his neck that 3 months of trench warfare had embedded into his spine. The crack of a distant rifle shot echoed across the cratered landscape, and Mitchinson's helmet flew backward, clattering against the duckboards. The corporal dropped like a stone, and for 3 terrible heartbeats, every man nearby thought they'd witnessed another death. But Mitchinson scrambled up, wide-eyed and gasping, his hand flying to his head where the bullet had struck his steel Brodie helmet dead center, leaving a spectacular dent but not penetrating through. The incident sparked something in Brooks's methodical farmer's mind. He'd spent decades solving practical problems with practical solutions: how to keep sheep from wandering through broken fences, how to fool crows away from newly planted fields, how to make predators waste effort on decoys while the real flock grazed safely elsewhere. That night, as shells whistled overhead and rats scurried through the trenches seeking scraps, Brooks sat in the dugout, sketching diagrams on the back of a letter from his wife Martha, who'd written asking when he'd be home to help with the spring shearing. According to records preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives, documenting the innovations born from trench warfare's desperate circumstances, Brooks wasn't the first soldier to consider deception tactics against snipers. But what happened next would distinguish his approach from mere survival instinct and transform it into psychological warfare. His plan was absurdly simple, almost childishly so, which is precisely why his fellow soldiers initially dismissed it as the rambling ideas of a man who'd spent too long breathing in gas fumes. But Brooks knew something about predators that the younger men didn't. They had patterns, and patterns could be exploited. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Ashworth Pemberton, 3rd Viscount Pemberton and commander of the 8th Battalion, Yorkshire Regiment, stared at Private Brooks with a kind of bewildered expression, typically reserved for men who'd suggested surrendering to the Germans and asking politely for tea. The morning of April 25th, 1917, found Pemberton in his dugout headquarters a reinforced hole in the ground that smelled perpetually of damp earth, and the whiskey he kept hidden in his field, desk listening to what he would later describe in his memoirs as the most preposterous tactical suggestion I'd encountered since Private Henderson proposed training rats to carry grenades to enemy positions. Brooks stood at attention, his uniform caked with the gray-brown mud that had become the unofficial color of the Western Front, and explained his scheme with the patient tone he'd once used to explain sheep breeding to skeptical buyers at Malton Livestock Market. He proposed mounting helmets on sticks and raising them above the trench parapets at irregular intervals, creating false targets that would draw sniper fire, waste ammunition, and most crucially reveal the snipers' positions for British counter-snipers to eliminate. "Absolutely barmy," muttered Captain Geoffrey Thornton, the battalion's intelligence officer, who stood beside Pemberton's desk studying trench maps. "You want to wave our equipment at the enemy like we're conducting a bloody puppet show? What's next? Private shadow plays to confuse their artillery?" But Sergeant Major Albert Whitmore, a grizzled career soldier who'd fought in the Second Boer War and understood that survival often trumped military dignity, saw something in the simplicity. He'd watched too many bright young men die because conventional tactics failed to account for the medieval siege warfare that trench combat had become. "Begging your pardon, sir," Whitmore interjected, his Yorkshire accent thick as treacle, "but desperate times and all that. Now the Hun snipers are killing us 3-1. If Brooks's trick draws even a few shots, we learn where the bastards are hiding. The discussion that followed revealed the class tensions simmering beneath military hierarchy. Pemberton, educated at Harrow and Cambridge, instinctively distrusted solutions proposed by enlisted men, particularly those who'd spent more time with livestock than with tactical manuals. Yet the casualty reports couldn't be ignored. 7 dead in 4 days had become 9 dead in 6 days, and the battalion's morale was eroding like the trench walls after heavy rain. Finally, Pemberton authorized a limited trial, largely because Whitmore convinced him that the cost of few spare helmets and some wooden stakes was negligible compared to the cost of continued inaction. "You have 24 hours, Brooks," Pemberton said, dismissing the private with a wave. "If this foolishness accomplishes nothing but making us look ridiculous, you'll be on latrine duty for the remainder of your natural life." Brooks saluted and left, accompanied by Whitmore and 3 volunteers. Private Daniel O'Sullivan, an Irish farmhand who'd crossed to England seeking work before the war, found him. Private Robert Chen, a Liverpudlian of Chinese descent whose father ran a shipping business. And Lance Corporal Thomas Webb, a former music hall performer who appreciated the theatrical nature of Brooks's plan. They spent the afternoon of April 26 scavenging materials from the trenches' detritus. The Western Front was, if nothing else, abundantly supplied with broken things. The construction of what the men began calling Fritzbaiters consumed the late afternoon of April 26, 1917, in a section of trench the battalion had nicknamed Suicide Alley for reasons that required no explanation. Brooks directed his small team with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to building sheep: pens measured twice, cut once, and always account for the stupidity of your adversary, whether that adversary walked on 4 legs or spoke German. They started with 6 standard-issue Brodie helmets, the distinctive steel bowlers that had replaced the soft caps that proved utterly useless against shrapnel. 3 were damaged helmets destined for salvage, already sporting dents and holes that testified to their violent histories. The other 3 were requisitioned from the quartermaster stores, a transaction that required Sergeant Major Whitmore to employ his considerable talent for creative inventory management, a skill he'd perfected over 23 years of military service. For the mounting apparatus, they used broken rifle stocks, shattered sections of trench support timbers, and lengths of communications wire. Webb, drawing on his music hall experience with stage props, suggested adding texture and dimension to make the helmets appear more realistic from a distance. He stuffed several with sandbags to approximate the shape of a human head and shoulders, while O'Sullivan used mud and torn uniform scraps to create shadow effects around the helmet bases that mimicked a soldier's neck and upper body. "The Germans aren't fools," Brooks explained as he demonstrated the mechanism, a simple pivot system that allowed the helmet to be raised, exposed briefly, then lowered again using a length of wire operated from relative safety. "They've been at this as long as we have. But they're human, and humans have instincts that override thinking. You see movement where a head should be, you take the shot. It's like seeing a rabbit bolt in your peripheral vision. The body reacts before the brain catches up." Chen, whose father had taught him about the ancient Chinese stratagem of making noise in the east while attacking in the west, appreciated the psychological dimension. "It's not just about wasting their ammunition," he observed, carefully positioning one of the decoys near a firing step. It's about making them doubt themselves. After they've shot at 10 fake heads, will they hesitate when they see a real one? That hesitation could save lives. By dusk, they'd constructed 6 deployable decoys and identified 8 positions along Suicide Alley, where the decoys could be raised with minimal risk to the operators. The plan called for a regular deployment, sometimes multiple decoys simultaneously, sometimes a single helmet at varying intervals, never establishing a predictable pattern that the German observers might decode. Night fell across Flanders with the peculiar quiet that preceded artillery exchanges, broken only by distant machine gun chatter and the occasional flare that transformed the landscape into a ghostly tableau of frozen shadows. Brooks gathered his team in the dugout, where they'd sleep until dawn brought the test of their creation. The 5th of May, 1917, arrived with the kind of pale dawn that seemed designed specifically to make soldiers feel their mortality more acutely. Brooks woke at 4:45 in the morning, his internal clock still tuned to farming rhythms, despite months in this industrial slaughterhouse. He found the other volunteers already awake. Men preparing for battle rarely slept well, and men preparing for an experiment that might draw concentrated enemy fire slept worse. At precisely 0500 hours, as the first genuine light began distinguishing the horizon from the mud, Brooks positioned himself at the first station, while Webb took the second, O'Sullivan the third, and Chen the fourth. Sergeant Major Whitmore moved between positions, ensuring everyone understood the signals and timing. 30 yards down the trench line, Lance Corporal Edwin Hartley, the battalion's finest marksman, a former competitive shooter from Cerise, settled into a concealed sniper position with his pattern 14 rifle and a periscope rifle attachment that allowed him to observe and shoot without exposing himself. The first decoy rose at 0513, a helmet mounted on what appeared to be a soldier's shoulders emerging slowly above the parapet in Sector 7. Brooks controlled it with steady hands, raising it just high enough to present a target, holding it exposed for 3 seconds. Long enough for a sniper to acquire the target, but brief enough to simulate a cautious soldier taking a quick look. Nothing happened. The helmet remained unpunctured, mocking Brooks's theory with its intact steel surface. He lowered it, counted to 47, a deliberately irregular interval, and raised it again. This time, with a slight lateral movement as though the soldier were shifting position for a better view. The crack of the rifle shot arrived before the sound, a principle of physics that Brooks had learned viscerally in the trenches. The bullet struck the helmet's left side with a sharp metallic clang that rang down the trench like a bell announcing church services in peacetime Yorkshire. The helmet spun on its mount, and Brooks heard Webb release a low whistle of indication from his position 20 feet away. "Got the bastard's attention," Whitmore muttered, peering through a periscope at the German lines 400 yards distant. "Southeast corner, that ruined farmhouse with the collapsed barn. Hartley, you see it?" Hartley's voice came back, calm and professional, observing. "No muzzle flash visible yet, but I've got the sector marked. Waiting for another shot to confirm position." Brooks let 32 seconds pass. Irregular intervals were crucial, then had Webb raise a different decoy from Sector 9. 60 feet down the trench line. This one featured the sandbag padding Webb had engineered, giving it a more pronounced three-dimensional profile. It rose, paused, began to lower, and another shot cracked across no man's land, striking the helmet squarely enough to knock it clean off its mounting. The pattern continued through the morning of May 5th, 1917, with a rhythm that began to feel almost ritualistic: rise, pause, shoot, lower, wait, repeat. By 0830 hours, the German snipers had fired 17 rounds at Brooks's decoys, a fact that Sergeant Major Whitmore recorded meticulously in a notebook he'd begun keeping specifically for this experiment. The shooting gallery atmosphere would have been almost comical, if not for the very real danger that a German observer might deduce the deception and redirect fire toward the actual positions where men operated the decoy mechanisms. But something unexpected began emerging from the data, something that fascinated Brooks even as it unfolded. The German snipers weren't just shooting reflexively, they were displaying patterns of behavior that revealed as much about their psychological state as their tactical positions. Some shots came rapidly after the target appeared, suggesting aggressive or perhaps younger snipers eager to increase their kill counts. Other shots arrived after longer pauses, indicating more cautious, experienced marksmen who waited for the perfect moment, ensuring the target remained steady before firing. Lance Corporal Hartley had identified 3 distinct sniper positions by mid-morning. The farmhouse ruins that first revealed itself, a church bell tower approximately 520 yards southeast, and a reinforced observation post concealed in what remained of an orchard between the trench lines. Each position had fired multiple times, and each misrepresented not just wasted ammunition, but a small psychological victory for the British troops, who could now move more freely, knowing the Germans had expended efforts shooting at metal and wood. Private Chen, operating Sector 4 with methodical precision, noted something else. The snipers seemed to communicate with each other, because after the farmhouse position missed 3 consecutive shots, the bell tower position took over. As if the first sniper had signaled that his angle was compromised or his luck had turned. This suggested a coordinated network rather than independent operators, intelligence that Captain Thornton would later incorporate into battalion planning. By noon, Lieutenant Colonel Pemberton himself arrived at Suicide Alley. drawn by reports that Brooks's preposterous scheme had generated 26 confirmed enemy shots without a single British casualty. The aristocratic officer moved carefully along the trench, observing the operation with the kind of careful attention that indicated his initial skepticism was evolving into genuine interest. "How many helmets have we lost?" Pemberton asked Whitmore, watching Webb raise another decoy in the distance. "5 destroyed beyond use, sir. 3 more badly dented but still functional. We've been rotating them to different positions to maintain the illusion of multiple targets." Pemberton nodded slowly. "In our sniper teams?" "Hartley's marked for enemy positions, definitely. 2 more probably. Lieutenant Morrison's team has eliminated 1 confirmed German sniper, the one in the orchard. They waited until he took his 3rd shot at Brooks's dummy in Sector 7, spotted the muzzle flash, and got him clean. The mathematics of it struck everyone listening. 1 German sniper killed, multiple positions identified, 26 rounds of German ammunition wasted, 0 British casualties, and all at the cost of 5 steel helmets that would have been replaced anyway through normal attrition. The evening of May 7, 1917, found Brooks and his team in the battalion's headquarters dugout, an unusual elevation for enlisted men who typically inhabited the muddy democracy of the front-line trenches. Word of the helmet trick had spread with the remarkable speed that characterized all genuinely useful information. In military life, faster than official communications, slower than rumors about leave rotations, but with substantially more verification. Pemberton had summoned them to brief officers from the adjacent battalions, the 13th Durham Light Infantry to the north, and the 9th King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry to the south. The cramped dugout, illuminated by kerosene lamps that cast dancing shadows on earthen walls, reinforced with salvaged timber, hosted 8 officers, 3 sergeants, and the 4 privates whose stupid trick was rapidly becoming something larger than its humble origins. Major Harold Blackwood, commanding the Durham Battalion, listened to Brooks's explanation with the intensity of a man responsible for 300 lives in increasingly precarious circumstances. "You're telling me," Blackwood said, lighting a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly from what everyone politely didn't identify as shell shock, "that you've neutralized multiple German sniper positions using equipment we'd otherwise throw away?" "Not neutralized, sir," Brooks corrected with the deference appropriate to rank, but the confidence of proven results. "Identified and distracted. We've forced them to reveal positions, waste ammunition, and second-guess themselves. Lance Corporal Hartley and his counter-sniper team have done the actual neutralizing, 3 confirmed. German snipers eliminated in 4 days, with 2 more probable kills awaiting confirmation." Webb, ever the performer, had prepared a demonstration using scale models constructed from ration tins and wire. He showed the officers how the decoys worked, emphasizing the irregular timing and varied positioning that prevented pattern recognition. "The key is unpredictability," Webb explained, moving the miniature helmets with theatrical flair. "We never raise the same decoy twice in succession, never use the same time interval, never establish rhythm. Keeps them reactive rather than analytical." Captain Reginald Foster Williams of the King's Own Yorkshire, a career officer whose family had produced soldiers since Waterloo, raised a concern that others were clearly thinking. What happens when the Germans realize they're being fooled? Don't we risk making them more cautious, more difficult to deceive in future? Chen answered this, drawing on the strategic principles his father had taught him from military treatises older than Britain itself. "Respectfully, sir, that's the beauty of it. Even if they suspect some targets are decoys, they can't risk assuming all targets are false. The moment they stop shooting at what might be a decoy, they miss the opportunity to shoot at what might be a real soldier. We've introduced uncertainty into their decision-making process. Uncertainty causes hesitation, and hesitation means fewer British casualties." The logic proved compelling. By the meeting's end, both visiting battalions had committed to implementing their own versions of the helmet trick, with Brooks, Webb, O'Sullivan, and Chen assigned to spend the following week rotating through friendly positions, teaching others how to construct and deploy the decoys effectively. While impossible to know with certainty what transpired in the German trenches opposing the British 8th Battalion Yorkshire Regiment, German military records from late April and early May of 1917, preserved in the Bundesarchiv in Frey-Bergrevel, mounting. Frustration among sniper teams operating in the sector designated as Abschnitt-Viersen, facing the British lines near Arras. Lieutenant Friedrich Hoffmann, commanding a sniper detachment of the 21. Reserve Division, wrote in his after-action report, dated the 8th of May, 1917. Enemy activity in our observation sector has become increasingly irregular and difficult to predict. Multiple targets present themselves throughout daylight hours, but confirmation of successful shots has decreased dramatically. Ammunition expenditure has increased, while confirmed casualties have decreased, suggesting either improved British medical evacuation or enhanced defensive techniques that require tactical reassessment. What Hoffman's carefully neutral military language concealed was a psychological reality that Private Jakob Weiss, sniper in the same unit, described more bluntly in a letter to his brother that was intercepted by British intelligence 3 weeks later. The English have become ghosts, or devil's eye, cannot tell which. I am certain I have struck 6 men through the head or throat this past week. Perfect shots at ranges where I cannot miss. Yet when we observe through the scopes afterward, we see the same positions occupied, the same movements continuing as though my bullets passed through air. Either I have lost my skill, which I do not believe, or something unnatural occurs in those trenches. Weiss's confusion was precisely what Brooks had intended to create. The psychological impact of phantom targets extended beyond wasted ammunition into a more insidious realm. Doubt. Snipers were elite soldiers, selected for exceptional marksmanship, patience, and nerves. They took pride in their kill counts, maintained personal records of confirmed eliminations, and competed informally for status within their units. When those perfect shots failed to produce results, when that competition became impossible to score accurately, the psychological foundation of sniper effectiveness began to crack. German commanders initially attributed the decrease in confirmed kills to various factors. British soldiers becoming more cautious after suffering heavy casualties, improved British helmets that deflected shots more effectively, or simple statistical variance in combat results. It took nearly 2 weeks before Hauptmann Ernst Richter, observing through a high-powered artillery scope from a position 600 yards behind the front lines, actually witnessed a British soldier absorb a bullet, spin dramatically, and then rise again moments later from the same position. Richter's report, dated May 17, 1917, identified the deception explicitly. The British are employing dummy targets helmets mounted on supports to draw fire and identify our sniper positions. The technique is simple but effective, exploiting our marksman's instincts and wasting valuable ammunition. Recommend immediate dissemination of countertactics to all frontline units. But by the time German snipers received instructions to verify targets more carefully before shooting, the damage to German effectiveness had already been done. More critically, the instruction to hesitate and verify introduced exactly the delay that Brooks's innovation had intended to create, a delay measured in seconds that could mean the difference between life and death for British soldiers moving through the trenches. The 3rd week of May, 1917, witnessed the evolution of Brooks's simple trick into something approaching systematic doctrine. As the technique spread along the British lines from battalion to battalion, soldiers began introducing variations and improvements that reflected their own experiences and creativity. What had started as one farmer's practical solution to a specific problem was becoming part of the Western Front's ongoing improvisation. The desperate innovation that characterized warfare when traditional tactics collided with industrial-scale killing efficiency. Private Thomas Webb, whose theatrical background had contributed significantly to the decoy designs, developed what he called the traveling show, a system using wire and pulleys that allowed a single helmet to be moved laterally along the trench parapet, simulating a soldier crawling or moving between positions. The device was crude, prone to jamming, and required 2 operators to function smoothly. But when it worked, the effect was spectacular. German snipers would track the moving target, fire repeatedly, and reveal their positions through multiple muzzle flashes that made counter-sniper work dramatically easier. Meanwhile, in the Durham Light Infantry sector to the north, Pemberton, no relation to the lieutenant colonel, introduced conversation decoys, pairs of helmets positioned close together, as though 2 soldiers were speaking, one rising slightly higher than the other to simulate the natural posture of men in conversation. The Germans found this presentation irresistible, perhaps because it represented not just a single target, but the opportunity for a double kill, the kind of achievement that earned snipers recognition and additional leave. The innovation that troubled some officers came from Private O'Sullivan, whose solution was as effective as it was morally ambiguous. He began attaching red-stained cloth to some helmets, creating the appearance of previous wounds or blood, theorizing that German snipers might assume these represented medics or wounded.
Soldiers.
The soldiers' targets that might draw fire despite the protections supposedly afforded by the Geneva Convention. When O'Sullivan raised one of these doctor decoys on May 19, 1917, it drew 5 consecutive shots from different German positions within 30 minutes, suggesting the tactic touched something deeply provocative in enemy marksmen. Lieutenant Colonel Pemberton ordered O'Sullivan to discontinue the practice. Not from humanitarian concerns, such niceties had largely evaporated in the grinding reality of trench warfare, but from pragmatic worry that if the Germans realized they were being specifically baited with false medical targets, reprisals against actual British medical personnel might follow. O'Sullivan complied, though he privately told Brooks that the Huns started shooting medics months ago. Whatever the conventions say, so I was only balancing accounts. By late May, the British Second Army headquarters had received sufficient reports about the helmet decoy technique that staff officers began drafting formal tactical guidance for distribution to all frontline units. The document, preserved in the National Archives at Kew, codified Brooks's innovation into official doctrine under the remarkably uninspiring title Technical Note 47. Regarding the employment of false targets for counter-sniper operations, the note credited the technique's development to Frontline Initiative without naming Brooks specifically, bureaucratic anonymity that would characterize his contribution for decades afterward. The formalization brought resources, dedicated production of helmet decoys by re-area workshops, standardized mounting equipment, and training for new soldiers rotating to the front. The summer of 1917 transformed the Western Front into a landscape of calculated attrition, where innovations like Brooks's helmet trick existed alongside horrors like poison, gas, and flamethrowers in humanity's expanding catalog of ways to kill efficiently. By June, the decoy technique had spread beyond the British lines. Canadian units adopted it enthusiastically. French poilus created their own variations using the distinctive Adrian helmets, and even Australian battalions reported success with the approach in their sectors. What Brooks and his fellow soldiers couldn't know was how their simple deception would influence military thinking far beyond the trenches of Flanders. In July of 1917, a young infantry captain named Bernard Law Montgomery, who would later achieve fame as Field Marshal Montgomery of Alamino, observed the helmet trick while touring frontline positions with his commanding officer. Montgomery noted the technique in his personal journal, describing it as an example of tactical innovation emerging from practical necessity rather than staff college theory, precisely the kind of thinking we must encourage in junior officers and enlisted men. The principle embedded in Brooks's innovation using deception to force enemy reactions that revealed positions and wasted resources would resurface in future conflicts wearing different forms. During the Second World War, elaborate deception operations like Operation Fortitude employed the same psychological logic on a strategic scale. Make the enemy shoot at phantoms, commit resources to false targets, and create uncertainty that paralyzes decision-making. The lineage from one Yorkshire farmer's helmet on a stick to entire phantom armies assembled to deceive Nazi intelligence represented a continuity of human ingenuity applied to the problem of survival. But the technique's success also illustrated the narrowing gap between clever tactics and battlefield necessity. By August of 1917, German forces had largely adapted to the helmet trick, training snipers to observe for longer periods, verify targets through multiple indicators, and resist the instinctive shot at anything resembling a human head. The innovation's effectiveness declined as novelty wore off. Following the inevitable pattern of military adaptation, where every advantage eventually spawns a countermeasure, Private Brooks himself was wounded on the 23rd of August, 1917, not by a sniper ironically, but by shrapnel from an artillery shell that struck near his dugout during a German bombardment. The injury wasn't severe by Western Front standards, severe lacerations to his left leg and arm.
Permanent
disability. Enough to earn him evacuation to a hospital in England and eventual discharge from active service in November. He returned to his farm in Yorkshire, to his wife Martha, and the sheep that had waded through 3 springs without his experienced hand at shearing time. He never spoke much about the helmet trick, according to his grandchildren's later recollections. When pressed, he'd describe it as common sense applied to an uncommon situation, refusing to claim any special brilliance. The war had taught him, as it taught millions of others, that survival often mattered more than glory, that small cleverness could be as valuable as great heroism, and that the men who made it home were often those who thought practically rather than romantically about the business of killing and avoiding being killed. The war ended on the 11th of November, 1918, when Brooks was 51 years old, back among his sheep on the Yorkshire moors, where wind carried the smell of heather instead of cordite. The official casualty figures for his battalion, compiled painstakingly by regimental historians in the years after the armistice, showed a statistically significant decline in sniper-related deaths during the period from May through August of 1917. When the helmet decoy technique saw its widest implementation, 7 sniper casualties per week dropped to fewer than 3, and while multiple factors contributed to this reduction, the correlation was strong enough that military analysts included the helmet trick in post-war studies of effective counter-sniper tactics. Lieutenant Colonel Pemberton, 3rd Viscount Pemberton, survived the war and published his memoirs in 1923 under the title Mud and Majesty. For years on the Western Front, he dedicated 3 pages to Brooks's innovation, writing with the perspective that peace and distance provided. I confess that I initially dismissed Private Brooks as a well-meaning fool, proposing a scheme worthy of music hall comedy rather than modern warfare. This judgment reflected my own prejudices more than any careful analysis of the proposal's merits. The war taught many lessons, not least among them that innovation often emerges from unexpected sources, and that the class distinctions we maintained so carefully in civilian life proved less useful than practical intelligence when shells were falling and men were dying. Brooks himself remained largely unknown outside his immediate community. No medals were awarded for the helmet trick. The British military awarded valor decorations for courage under fire, not for cleverness that reduced the need for courage. He appeared briefly in a local newspaper in 1932 when a reporter researching war stories for the Armistice Day edition discovered his role in developing the decoy technique. The article, titled "Local Farmers' Trick Saved Lives in Great War," ran on page 7 of the Yorkshire Evening Post, wedged between advertisements for patent medicines and notices of agricultural markets. What survived more persistently than recognition was the principle Brooks had demonstrated that warfare, despite its terrible machinery and industrial scale, remained fundamentally a human endeavor where psychology mattered as much as ballistics. The German snipers who fired at his decoys weren't defeated by superior equipment or overwhelming force. They were defeated by their own instincts, exploited through simple deception that cost almost nothing to implement but saved lives that could never be quantified precisely. Modern military historians, examining the tactical innovations of the First World War, place Brooks's helmet trick in the category of adaptive field expedients, solutions developed by combat soldiers to address immediate tactical problems without requiring approval or resources from higher command. These innovations represent a parallel stream of military development that often proved more immediately effective than the formal doctrines developed by staff colleges and headquarters far from the actual fighting. The helmet that Brooks used for his first successful deception, the one that drew fire on May 5, 1917, and survived with a dramatic dent in its crown, was reportedly kept by Sergeant Major Whitmore as a memento. Whitmore's family donated it to the Imperial War Museum in 1956, where it remained in storage until 1988, when a curator researching everyday objects of trench warfare rediscovered it and mounted a small exhibition on improvised tactics. The helmet now resides in the museum's permanent collection, labeled simply, "Steel helmet used as decoy target, Western Front, circa 1917. Brooks died in 1946 at the age of 79, having lived through the Second World War and witnessed his grandchildren turn from that conflict with their own stories of innovation and survival. His obituary in the Malton Messenger mentioned his First World War service in passing, but focused more on his contributions to local agriculture, introducing new sheep breeding techniques, serving on the Rural Council, and maintaining the stone walls that divided Yorkshire fields for generations. Perhaps that's fitting. The men who survive wars often find that the things they did to stay alive matter less in the peaceful years that follow than the ordinary work of building and maintaining the world those sacrifices were meant to preserve. Brooks's helmet trick saved lives. How many exactly can never be calculated with certainty. But it stands as testament to a particular kind of courage, not the dramatic heroism of charging machine guns or holding impossible positions, but the quieter courage of thinking practically, acting decisively, and refusing to accept that there's nothing to be done when men are dying unnecessarily. That's the real legacy of one British farmer's stupid trick, not that it won the war or changed military history forever, but that it reminded everyone who learned about it that individual initiative still mattered, that cleverness could save lives, and that sometimes the best response to overwhelming force is not greater force, but smarter thinking. In the end, William Ernest Brooks proved what farmers have always known, that foxes can be fooled, predators can be outsmarted, and survival often depends on understanding your enemy's nature better than they understand themselves.